In September of 1888, the Football League kicked off and paved the way for what professional football would become in England today. A multi-tiered league system that installs a sense of pride for traditional football fans, strikes fear into North American franchise owners, and if you rotate it a few degrees, a collective ooh from conspiracy theorists. But it was never intended to look like this. Go back 100 plus years, and professional football in England looked a lot more fragmented. So, how did we go from the Football League being a closed club of 12 teams to a unified national structure with promotion and relegation? Well, I'm about to tell you. Context! In March of 1888, William McGregor, a director at Aston Villa, sent a polite letter to a handful of clubs in the North and Midlands of the country, essentially saying, "There's money to be made here, we need to get our together." He wanted a guaranteed fixture list, because, at the time, football clubs in England were reliant on ad hoc friendlies and the FA Cup for ticket income. And, given that the top players were now demanding more for their talents in this new professional sporting environment, that just wasn't enough. McGregor's original vision, which ultimately ended up as the Football League, was basically a private members club. McGregor initially proposed a one-town, one-club rule in order to ensure geographical diversity while also protecting member clubs from competing with one another for a local supporter base. When the Football League kicked off with its 12 founders in September of 1888, they had effectively paved the way for what professional football would become in the industrial North, Midlands, and beyond. But if you weren't part of the club, you were out on your own, waiting on scraps from the Football League and the occasional cup tie. Naturally, the teams that weren't invited to Big Billy's No Homers clubhouse were less than thrilled. So, a group of rejects, led by J.G. Hall, the secretary of Crewe Alexandra, met at the Royal Hotel in Crewe to form their very own competition, the Combination. It was an ambitious project. 20 clubs, nearly double the Football League, signed up to the new alternative competition, and it included the likes of Newton Heath, Manchester United, Small Heath, Birmingham City, Blackburn Olympic, the first Northern club to win the FA Cup, Bootle FC, from Merseyside, Notts Rangers, Nottingham, Crewe Alexandra, Crewe obviously, Grimsby Town, Grimsby, Darwin, from Netflix, and Burslem Port Vale, which doesn't exist anywhere in our space-time continuum because Port Vale isn't real. But while the Football League was organised, for the most part, with the efficiency of an obsessive Factorio addict, the Combination was run like that hastily put together WhatsApp group for your mate's stag do in 2 weeks' time. It was a complete mess. To begin with, there was no fixed schedule, nor fixed fixtures at all, come to think of it. Unlike the Football League, which had a regimented calendar of 22 home and away matches for each club, the Combination left it up to the clubs to sort out their own matches. This meant games just weren't being organised at all. It also wasn't exactly clear how many games each club should be participating in. According to the Sheffield Independent in April of 1888, each club was to play no less than 8 matches against clubs in the Combination. So while most teams seemed to play in and around 16 games, Port Vale were thought to have played as many as 25, and Blackburn Olympic as few as 5. With crowds coming out in favour of the Football League, the Combination was ultimately doomed to fail, with even the Athletic News deeming it useless. In April of 1889, the Combination was sacked off after just 1 season. Nobody won the thing due to the seemingly random nature of games played, and the whole thing was quietly forgotten about, like the WWF Brawl for All. Rather than repairing what was wrong with the Combination, league organisers opted instead to throw it in the bin and just start from scratch. Just 1 month later, in May of 1889, the Football Alliance was born at the Douglas Hotel in Manchester. The people that brought you the Combination created a leaner, more organised competition that looked suspiciously like the Football League, down to the same number of teams, geographic area, and even the novel idea of actually getting teams to play the same number of matches. The lucky 12 to make the Football Alliance cut would be some of the more successful clubs from the prior season's failed experiment, as well as the likes of Sunderland and Sunderland Albion. Though Sunderland were booted from the competition before a ball had even been kicked, after representatives from the club failed to show up for a meeting and the rest of the gang chose to interpret that as they don't want to play with us anymore. The Football Alliance was infinitely times more successful than the combination, purely on the basis that they actually finished a season. The Wednesday, or Sheffield Wednesday, ended as inaugural champions, winning 15 of their 22 matches and even made it to the FA Cup final, showcasing that teams in the Football Alliance were good enough to hang out with the elite clubs of the Football League. Ignore the fact they got walloped 6-1 in the final. Despite challenging the status of the Football League, the original football competition was still seen as the daddy. At the end of the first 1889-90 season, 5 of the 12 Alliance clubs applied to join the Football League. And while all were rejected, the dynamic between the two organisations shifted when Stoke, a founding member of the Football League, failed to get re-elected for the following season. Rather than disappearing into footballing limbo, Stoke joined the Football Alliance, effectively creating the first instance of a club dropping down into a de facto secondary tier. The next season, Stoke won the Football Alliance and bounced straight back into the Football League, no parachute payment needed, and even took 6th place Darwin up with them. Because that's how football worked back then. More on that in a moment. By 1892, the success of the Alliance, as well as further local competition from the Midlands League, which had formed a couple of years earlier, had become something that the Football League could no longer ignore. With more successful clubs emerging, the league recognised that in order to keep its reputation as the top league in English football, it would need to expand to incorporate some of these clubs into its own ranks, but couldn't do that by just bloating out the division, which had grown from 12 to 14 and would consist of 16 teams for the 1892-93 season. For the Football League to really flourish, it needed to build downwards, provide a platform for teams to level up to the A-League, while also keeping them under the Football League TM umbrella. So, in March of 1892, the Football League drew up its plan for footballing dominion. League officials originally came up with a 3-tier system, with 16 teams making up the first division, 12 teams, mainly consisting of members from the Football Alliance making up the second division, and 10 teams from the Midlands League making up the third division, forming a structure that vaguely resembled the tower from Mortal Kombat. However, this proposed expansion of the Football League also brought up a problem. How is movement between these divisions decided? In a world before standardised promotion/relegation places, it was all a tad more improvised. Up until that point, teams that finished bottom of the Football League had faced what was called re-election, whereby clubs that made up the rest of the league would vote on whether these clubs could stay and play the following season, or be booted out in favour of any of the other eager clubs applying to be part of the competition. This way of doing things wasn't going to fly with the teams making up the rest of this new structure, as more times than not, clubs that faced re-election were just kept in by their mates. In fact, of the 14 teams that had been up for re-election since the league's inception in 1888, only 2 had failed to remain in the Football League. So instead, a new idea was proposed. One that would reward sporting merit and league performance, as well as give teams that finished bottom of the new Football League Division 1 a second chance, as it were. The bottom 3 teams of the first division would play a series of test matches, as they were called, against the top 3 teams of the second division, with 16th in Division 1 playing first in Division 2, 15th in Division 1 playing second from Division 2, and 14th in Division 1 playing third from Division 2. The winners of these test matches would play in the first division the following season. It was a compromise that most clubs were willing to tolerate. So the plans for a third tier were put on ice, and instead the Football League agreed to keep things to a manageable 2-tier system. 11 of the 12 teams in the Football Alliance were integrated into the expanded Football League, with Sheffield United replacing Birmingham St George's to make up a 12-team bottom shelf, with the election process kept in place to determine what happens to clubs that finish bottom of Division 2. While the idea of expanding the league obviously looked good on paper, not everyone was pleased with the thought of playing in a lower tier, dismissing the second division entirely before it even started. For instance, when a newly formed Liverpool applied to join the Football League in 1892, they requested to be fast-tracked straight into Division 1, as they didn't want to go through the trenches of the second division. The Football League told them that's not how it's done anymore, old chap, and Liverpool spent the campaign playing in the Lancashire League instead, but would end up accepting a seat at the second division table the following year in 1893. For other clubs, it was the financial implications of playing at a lower level that was the primary concern. Newcastle East End were also offered a place in Division 2 ahead of the 1892-93 season, but initially turned it down after deciding it just wasn't worth the hassle considering they'd have to lug it across the country every other weekend. It was even more of a concern for many clubs inside the Football League, when two of its founding 12 members, Notts County and Accrington, not Stanley, were defeated in test matches following the 1892-93 season. Neither club gave assurances that they would play in Division 2 the following year, and while Notts County were convinced to stick around, Accrington went their own way and joined the Lancashire League, though this decision was pretty piss poor in hindsight as the club went bust in 1896. Speaking of piss poor, test matches weren't exactly everyone's cup of tea either. Some commentators saw the use of them as an unfair way to measure long-term sporting merit. The umpire wrote, "There will, in the future, be a very distinctive opening for the top club in a lower class, by a fluky win, to knock out a club of better average merit in Class 1. On the other hand, clubs in the lower tier were peeved that an entire season's hard work could be undone by these one-off games. For example, the 1893 Division 2 champions, Small Heath, missed out on promotion to the top flight after losing their test match, and was stuck in the lower tier despite second and third place Darwin and Sheffield United's promotions. So, with test matches failing the grade, the Football League mixed things up again ahead of the 1895-96 season. Instead of a one-off match, the bottom two from Division 1 would face off against the top two from Division 2 in a series of 4 games, played home and away in a weird mini-league system. The top two of that would go on into the first division the following season, and third and fourth would play in Division 2. However, this system's flaw was exposed on April 30th, 1898, during a match between Stoke and Burnley. A draw in this final match of the Test Match Mini-League would result in both sides finishing first and second, so naturally it finished a not-so-thrilling 0-0. The convenient result meant that Burnley and Stoke would play in the first division the following season, at the expense of third-placed Newcastle. While some in the press blamed the low standard on the poor weather conditions, many papers, particularly those in the northeast of the country, claimed shenanigans were afoot. And while nothing was definitively proved, the Football League wasn't taking any chances. The mini-league system was scrapped the following season in favour of the automatic promotion/relegation system that we all know and love today. So to recap, by the end of the 19th century, the Football League structure looked like this. With the Football League Division 1 and 2 stacked upon one another, with a bunch of non-football leagues such as the Midlands League and the Lancashire League, essentially acting as feeder competitions to the Promised Land, forming the Football Upside Down T. Doesn't really have a ring to it, does it? Those of you that haven't drifted off at any point in the last 15 minutes might have detected a pattern with some of the teams that I've mentioned so far. They're all from above this line here. Where's all the southern clubs? While clubs in the north had embraced professionalism, the south had remained, for the most part, an amateur stronghold, doing it for the love of the game and all that. However, the growing commercial success of the teams in the north became impossible to ignore. Luton Town and Royal Arsenal would become the first southern clubs to adopt professionalism, with the latter becoming the first clubs south of Birmingham to join the Football League in 1893. In the face of this wave of league football being played in the north, a number of clubs in the south began wondering if it was something they should be doing as well. But the pro-amateur establishment at the London Football Association were sceptical of the professional league format that had taken hold in the north. But some Southerners tried to form one anyway. An initial attempt to form a Southern Football League was considered at a meeting at the London Football Association in 1890, but this was narrowly voted down by 47 votes to 46. A number of clubs tried again in 1892, when both the Southern Football League and Southern Alliance were formed, but one folded before a ball was even kicked, and the other got binned after one season. It took another 2 years for clubs in the south to give things another go, and create something that vaguely resembled a challenge to the dominance of the Football League to the north. The Southern Football League 2.0 was eventually formed in January of 1894, with a mixture of 16 professional and amateur clubs split between 2 divisions. And this time it worked. The inaugural season was a triumph for Millwall Athletic, who won the Division 1 title without losing a single match, recording 12 wins and 4 draws in 16 games. Millwall would go on to do the same when the league expanded the following season, before Southampton became the dominant force, winning 6 of the next 8 league titles. And this is where the balance of power in English football started shifting back towards the south, albeit briefly. Southampton's dominance, along with other emerging Southern League teams such as Bristol City and Tottenham Hotspur, showed that the south could be a focal point for top professional talent, attracting players who might otherwise have sought careers at clubs solely in the Football League. It also didn't hurt that there wasn't a salary cap for players competing for the Southern Football League clubs, as opposed to the £4 per week cap enforced upon professionals in the north from 1901. The Southern Football League's strength reached its peak at the turn of the century. Clubs from the competition consistently went deep into the latter stages of the FA Cup, often knocking out established northern clubs along the way, and players from the Southern Football League began picking up international caps. When England played Ireland at the Dell in 1901, 5 England players plied their trade for clubs in the Southern League. When Tottenham Hotspur lifted the FA Cup in 1901, defeating Sheffield United in the final, they became the first non-Football League side to lift the trophy since the league's inception in 1888. The on-pitch success of these southern clubs would have no doubt changed the DEFCON levels at the Football League HQ from yellow to more of a golden chestnutty orange. Southerners knew ball after all, and just like the Football Alliance a decade earlier, integrating the best from the Southern League may not be such a bad idea. However, a marriage between the North and the South would be a hell of a lot more complicated than what had come before in 1892. For one, the relationship between the Football League clubs and the Southern League clubs wasn't exactly fantastic. The wedge between the two regions, caused by the battle to legalise professionalism during the 1880s, still resembled the old Pepsi logo. And the poaching of northern talent by southern clubs, without the need to pay transfer fees I might add, hadn't done much to bridge the divide. Even though this was basically what northern clubs did with Scottish players during the 1880s. There were also logistical challenges that came with travelling up and down the length of the country for away fixtures. In a pre-Ryanair flash sale environment, Gravesend away didn't look like the most appealing fixture for a club like Blackpool or Sunderland. Or anyone, really. Regardless of these challenges, there were some who had tried to make it happen. In 1898, Arsenal chairman George Levy proposed splitting the Football League's second division into a northern and southern section to accommodate teams from the Southern Football League. But this was quickly thrown out. Georgie tried again in 1900 and 1902, but by then Southern clubs had little interest in playing in a weaker second tier and wanted to be fast-tracked into the first division, which, like Liverpool years earlier, wasn't going to fly with other clubs. So George followed up by suggesting the whole league should be regionalised, with the top teams from a northern section and a south and midland section competing in an end-of-season playoff to decide the title, much like what is used in many American sports today. But that went nowhere. Charles Edward Sutcliffe, a lawyer and official for the Football League, resurrected the idea in 1907, but, as is the theme here, that didn't achieve liftoff either. Despite the eagerness from some within the Football League and the Southern League to create a truly national system, there was seemingly no way to overcome the various differences between the two parties. And while the Southern League had started the decade with a strong hand, as the years went on, their bargaining position got weaker. Between 1901 and 1908, the Football League welcomed a number of clubs from the south into its ranks, as the allure of making it to the more financially lucrative Division 1 was too much to resist. The 1901 Southern League runners-up, Bristol City, were elected to the Football League Division 2 for the 1901-1902 campaign. A newly formed Chelsea, as well as Clapton Orient, joined in 1905, Southern League champions Fulham in 1907, and Tottenham Hotspur in 1908. With Spurs joining the Football League, there were now 5 teams around the nation's capital that were aligned with the more prestigious competition to the north. And for the metropolitan clubs that remained in the Southern League, this was a right old headache. With some of its crown jewels removed, the status of the Southern Football League began to diminish. The movement of player transfer traffic switched back northwards, FA Cup runs were now more of a crawl, and many of the South's more ambitious clubs feared that the competition couldn't compete with the appeal of the Football League sides that were now firmly embedded in the South. So, in the spring of 1909, Southern League representatives met again with the Football League to discuss the possibility of merging the two competitions into a national system in what would result in a proposed third division, consisting of 18 Southern League clubs and 2 from the North and Midlands. This time there was optimism that the Southern League would finally be welcomed into the warming glow of the Football League. But, despite a meeting of the league voting 27-13 in favour of such a resolution, it failed to pass the 3/4 majority needed to become reality. Clubs that would probably languish in an expanded Football League wanted to cling on to their spot in the second tier, while others just couldn't look past their resentment of Southern League clubs. The idea of an expanded Football League was floated a couple of more times over the next 5 years, but it looks like the moment had passed. By the early 1910s, the Football League had grown to 40 teams split between 2 healthy-looking divisions, and the best clubs from the south were already competing in the system. So why bother changing things? A 4-year-long conflict on the continent has a tendency to give you some perspective. Following the end of the First World War, the 2 football leagues, which had been put on ice for a few years, had to try and pick up where they left off. And while clubs from around the country were feeling the post-war financial strain, the Southern Football League in particular was looking increasingly in the pits. In an article in the Athletic News on May 3, 1920, Charles Sutcliffe threw the Southern League a lifeline and once again outlined his plan for an expanded Football League. He didn't just want 1 third tier, he wanted 2, split between a Southern section, made up by clubs from the Southern Football League First Division, and a Northern section, each consisting of 20 or 22 teams, with the champions from each section gaining promotion to the Football League Division 2. While clubs in Charlie's split Division 3 would only have limited voting rights, as well as meaning only 2 promotion spots were available to 44 teams, it would soften the financial burden from travel expenses. And it wasn't like the Southern League clubs had much of a choice at this point. Chazza's proposed plan finally made the dream of a National League system a reality. At the Football League's AGM in May of 1920, officials voted in favour of a third division, with the Southern section kicking off in the 1920-21 season, and the Northern section postponed for a year, while they cobbled together enough teams that could commit to playing 40+ games a season. By the late 1950s, the landscape of English football had changed. Improvements in the national rail and road networks made travelling across the country more feasible, so there wasn't really any point of having regionalised sections in the Football League. In 1958, the 2 separate third divisions were abolished and replaced with 2 national leagues, the easy-to-remember Third Division and the Fourth Division, with the previous season's performance dictating which clubs would fall where. But while the Football League had formed a standardised national hierarchy, it was still a closed shop because of the archaic re-election system. which was arguably worse than ever. If you were a non-league club playing in one of the many fragmented regional divisions, you had next to no chance of breaking it into the Football League. The disconnect was so big that between the 4 decades between resumption of football after World War II and 1986, only 6 teams had failed to be re-elected. During that time, Hartlepool was up for election 11 times and never once got booted out. 11! Diabolical. Fed up of constant rejection from the Football League, 20 of the best non-league clubs from the Southern League Premier Division and Northern Premier League formed the Alliance Premier League in 1979, a centralised national league that would act as a de facto 5th tier for semi-professional clubs looking to get the attention of the Football League. Unlike the Football League, the bottom 3 clubs of the Alliance Premier would automatically be relegated. The winners of the Alliance Premier would win the prize of being the sole candidates at the Football League re-election vote. So, how many winners of the Alliance Premier gained a seat at the Football League table? None. Between 1979 and 1986, each and every winner of the APL was fobbed off in favour of existing sides, with sorry Bath City and Enfield not even getting into double figures during the voting process in 1985 and 1986 respectively. But that's not to say the Alliance Premier League was for nothing. After years of lobbying and steady improvement of non-league infrastructure and commercial deals, the drop down from Division 4 to non-league had gone from looking absolutely terrifying to mildly terrifying. Ahead of the 1986-87 season, the Football League finally scrapped the old re-election system and agreed to a one-in, one-out system with the Alliance Premier League, which was renamed to the Football Conference. In 1987, Scarborough became the first non-league club to automatically earn their right to play in the Football League, at the expense of Lincoln City. Poor old Enfield, if you'd only won the season a year later. And that's where we'll leave things. Yes, I'm very aware that we've barely scratched the surface of non-league, but it deserves its own video, and I've blabbered on enough. I need to lie down. For now, in the year 1987, nearly 100 years since the inception of the Football League, it had grown from 12 teams in the North and the Midlands of the country to a unified national hierarchy, and the bridge between the league and non-league was complete. It would be an awful shame if someone was to, threaten to break away.